Thank you, Nathan, and good evening, everybody. And thank you for coming to hear our lecture on the promise to David. This is, of course, the third in a three-part series on the three great promises in the Bible. Over the last 2 weeks, we have looked at the previous two promises. There was the promise to Eve, the promise of life, and the promise to Abraham, the promise of land. And tonight we are looking at the promise to David, which is a promise of leadership, a promise of a king. And like any part of the Bible, this promise has to be understood in its context. So this was a promise that was given to King David. So let's understand some about the context of David's life. When the nation of Israel were first brought out of Egypt, they were brought into their land, and they had hundreds of years, the first few hundred years while they were in their land, the government was a little bit chaotic. They would have judges who would only rule a part of the land, and perhaps only for 20 or 40 years at a time. And then the judge would die, and that part of the land would descend into anarchy because there was no strong centralised government. And it got to a point when the people of Israel got sick of all of this instability that was caused by this constant change, constant flux in governments, the rise and fall of judges. They got sick of all of that change, and so they wanted a king. They wanted something more stable and enduring. They could see that the nations around them had kings, and they wanted a king like that. And so they asked for a king, and so then there were kings over the nation of Israel. Now, David wasn't the first king. David was arguably the second king, but David was the first good king of Israel. David was the first king who actually properly organised the kingdom. He was the first king who gave the people a degree of safety from invasion by the surrounding nations. And so the first part of David's reign was involved in a lot of military campaigns in ensuring the safety of the borders of the land, ensuring that Israel would be safe from invasion by their enemies. And once that safety was somewhat secured, then David started to turn his attention to other matters. And David looked around him, and he was living in a palace in Jerusalem. He was quite comfortable, but then he could see that the place where the nation worshipped God was still the tabernacle that had been built in the wilderness hundreds of years before. The tabernacle was sort of like a tent. It wasn't a permanent place of abode. It wasn't a permanent temple. And so David thought, well, if I'm living in this permanent house, but God is living in this tabernacle, that doesn't seem like a very good situation to me. So why don't I build a temple for God? And so David asked God if he could build a temple, and God sent his response back to David through Nathan the prophet. And that's what we have recorded here in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And God's response was basically, well, David, it's very good that you want to build me a temple, and I'm very pleased with that idea, but I have actually decided that someone else is going to build that temple. I've planned for someone else to build that temple. It's a good thing to be done, but it's not your job to do it, David. But I'm pleased that you've asked to do it. I know that you're thinking about the future of your people, and so here instead is a promise that I will take care of the future of your people after you are gone. And so that is the crux of this promise. It was a promise to David that God would take care of his people by ensuring the stability, the wisdom of their leadership in the future. So what does this promise that was given to David mean? Let's start to look into it in detail. There's a few key points that I wanted to look at, kind of 4 key points that I wanted to deal with tonight as part of this promise. And they're not the only points that are part of the promise to David, but they're perhaps the most helpful ones for us to consider as an introduction. So 2 Samuel 7 and in verse 12 we read the following, "And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom." Now in the King James Version that language is a little bit obscure perhaps, but we could look at a version which uses a slightly more modern language, the NIV, so it makes it a little bit clearer. He says, "When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood." In other words, David, when you have died, I am going to raise up a king to succeed you, and this king will be one of your descendants, one of your own flesh and blood. So that is the first point of the promise. God promised to David that after he had died, his seed, his descendants, would be established as kings on his throne. And that's actually quite a promise in those days. If we think about what we know of kings today, most of the kings and queens that we see around the world today are quite stable. They're sort of an appendage to democracies, and when the king dies or the queen dies, it's just their child who automatically inherits the throne. But historically, it hasn't always worked like that. If a king died, there would be perhaps a prolonged power struggle, and who knows who might get the throne after them. So for David to be told that his son would definitely inherit his throne, that was quite a reassuring promise. So point number 2, we're looking at verse 13. He says, "He shall build an house for my name." And so that's point number 2 here, that this son who would be king, he was the one who would build a house for God's name. He's the one who would build a temple. Now when it says, "He shall build a house for my name," that's biblical language. We don't have time to go into it in detail, but the name of God in the Bible is connected with the worship of God. And so when it says a house for my name, it really just means a house for worshipping God, or in other words, a temple. So Nathan says in this promise to David, he says, this son who will be king, he is the one who is going to build the temple for me. So point number 3 is from verse 14. "I will be his father, and he shall be my son." And if you think about it, that's a bit of an odd statement, because this son who was supposed to be king, well, David's just been promised that this king will be his son, one of his descendants. But now God is saying, well, this king is also going to be my son, is going to be God's son. So it's a little bit odd when we think about it, but perhaps you can think of it this way, that this son who would be king would have a very special relationship with God, like a father to his son. So point number 4, "Thy house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee." Verse 16. And I think the most important point here to pull out is that those 2 words, "before thee." So in other words, this kingdom would be established in David's sight. David would live to see this king established as king. He would live to see the establishment of this son in his kingdom. So that's a brief summary of the promise, the key points of the promise to David. And the question is, who is the son that this promise is speaking about? It's all speaking about this son who will be king, but who actually is this son? Well, there is one possible, very simple answer to that question. When David died, his kingdom passed to his son called Solomon. And this son called Solomon, he became king in David's stead, and he did almost everything that the promise spoke about. Solomon was David's son. Solomon built a temple for God. Solomon had a very special, close relationship with God. And David lived to see Solomon set on his throne. And so you could say that, well, Solomon fulfills pretty much all of the key points of this promise, does he not? And in fact, one very valuable method of Bible study is to use the Bible to interpret itself. And if we go to 1 Chronicles 28, which I'll put on the screen here, what we find is that the Bible actually quotes the promise to David and says it's speaking about Solomon. So it says, 1 Chronicles 28, verse 5 and 6, "And of all my sons, for Yahweh hath given me many sons, he hath chosen Solomon my son to sit upon the throne of the kingdom of Yahweh over Israel. And he said unto me, Solomon thy son, he shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father." So we just have those verses on the screen. I'll just highlight a few of the key points here that we've got, and we can actually line them up with these key points that we saw in the promise to David. So he hath chosen Solomon my son to sit upon the throne. Well, that lines up with point number 1. It was David's son who would be established as king. Point number 2 from the promise, he shall build a house for my name. Point number 3 from the promise, I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. So it lines up with all of these points from the promise to David. And now point number 4, which is that he would become king before, that David would live to see him become king. That's not dealt with in these verses, but we could look, say, at 1 Kings chapter 1, which tells us the story of how Solomon was anointed and set up as king before David's death, while David was alive. And so each of these 4 key points that we looked at, they can all apply to Solomon. They can all be speaking about Solomon. So Solomon is this son who the promise was speaking about, the son who would be king in David's stead, who would build a house for God's name. So that's a very quick, very simple answer. And the question is that all there is to it? God gave this great, impressive promise to David. Was he just speaking about the fact that David's son would be king in his stead? There's nothing very remarkable about that. Why would God give this great, incredible promise to David when all it means is that his son is going to be king after him? It doesn't seem like that's all there is to it. There's got to be more here. And that is something to bear in mind when we are reading the Bible. We need to remember that the most obvious answers to our questions, the most obvious interpretations of prophecies, don't always reveal the full picture. Often there are multiple layers of meaning. Often there is more than one answer. And when we look at the promise to David, I'm going to tell you that there are 2 layers of meaning. There are 2 different answers to the question. The promise to David has 2 layers of meaning. It can apply to Solomon, but it also applies to Jesus Christ. And I'm going to show you how we can get to that conclusion. And the way we'll do that is by means of a comparison. So we have our 4 points there down the side, and we have this little table. There's Solomon and Jesus Christ. And we will compare how this prophecy applies to these 2 men. Which one is the better answer? Is it just talking about Solomon, or is it talking about Jesus Christ? If it's talking about both, then which one is the deeper, truer, more significant answer to the question? So we're going to go through each of these 4 points and see how Solomon and Jesus Christ compare as the son of promise. And I apologise that we're not going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to take these slightly out of order, but that's just because I think it's easier to start with the easiest ones first. So let's look at this. We've seen this already. I will be his father and he shall be my son. Okay, and that was quoted in 1 Chronicles 28, speaking about Solomon. And so we've seen that does apply to Solomon, but Solomon wasn't literally God's son, was he? Solomon was David's son. So when God said that I have chosen Solomon to be my son, well, it's kind of speaking figuratively. Solomon wasn't literally God's son, but Solomon had a very special relationship with God, a very close relationship. A little bit like you might say if you had, say, a boss at your work who was very kind to you and taught you a lot of things and helped you to navigate the workplace when you were new, you might say that they had been like a father figure to you. And in a similar sense, God was a father to Solomon. He was like a father figure to Solomon, but he wasn't literally Solomon's father. But let's compare that to Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is literally the Son of God. And we get that, for instance, from Luke 1, verse 35. This was the angel speaking to Mary when she was told she would have this son, Jesus Christ. And the angel answered and said unto her, The Holy Spirit shall come upon thee, and the power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore also that holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God. So Jesus Christ didn't have a human father. Jesus Christ was conceived by the power of God. He was literally the Son of God. And so if we compare on this point Jesus Christ and Solomon, we're forced to the conclusion that Jesus Christ has a much better claim to be God's son. Jesus Christ is a much better interpretation of this promise to David for this particular point. Now let's move on to another point, and this is point number 1, which promised to David that one of his descendants would reign on his throne. We're told, David was told that one of his descendants would reign on his throne, and we know that that was fulfilled literally in Solomon. Solomon was one of David's sons. Solomon reigned on David's throne for 40 years, and so he fulfilled that part of the promise. But let's compare that with Jesus Christ. Solomon was just one of David's sons, but Jesus Christ is the greatest descendant of David of all time. And Jesus Christ is going to reign on the throne of David, not just for 40 years, but forever. And again, we can look at Luke chapter 1, and the quote I have up there on the screen draws us to this conclusion. It tells us, "He shall be great and shall be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David, and he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end." So Solomon's reign came to an end, but Jesus Christ will reign forever. Solomon was just one of David's sons, but Jesus Christ was the greatest of David's sons. Jesus Christ is the greatest man who has ever lived. And so once again, we are forced to the conclusion that Jesus Christ is the greater son of David. So if we look at this point of the prophecy, Jesus Christ is the better interpretation. Let's move on to another point. And this one's a little bit more detailed. We're told that this son of promise would build a house for God's name. And we know that Solomon did that. Solomon built a temple in Jerusalem for God. But what is less well known is that Solomon didn't just build a temple for God, the God of Israel, the true God, the living God. Solomon was also corrupted by his many wives, and he also built other temples in Jerusalem for false gods. And so if we're going to apply this prophecy, this promise, only to Solomon, well, it rings a little bit hollow because, well, do you think David would have been very happy with this promise if he'd been told, well, this son is going to build a house for my name, but he's also going to build a house for Baal and Ashtaroth and all of the other false gods who were known at the time? So we see that there's a bit of a crack in this interpretation here. Yes, it can apply to Solomon. He did build a temple, but he also built temples for idols. So we start to feel a little bit less sure of our ground applying that directly to Solomon. But what about Jesus Christ? Well, there's an interesting comment that was made at the dedication of Solomon's temple. And let's think about this. When Solomon had built his temple, and he did this prayer to dedicate the temple to God, and this was part of his prayer. He says, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and heaven of heavens cannot contain thee. How much less this house that I have builded?" And so what Solomon is saying is, yes, I have built this temple for God. I have built this physical building for God, but God doesn't actually live in a building. God is the whole power of the universe. God can't be contained in a building. And so I built a house for God's name, but God isn't truly going to dwell here in the truest sense. And that is a comment that is picked up in the New Testament by Stephen when he's making his defense to the Jews. And he says, "But Solomon built him an house. Solomon built God an house, howbeit the Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands." So Solomon had built this temple, but in reality, God doesn't live in a physical temple. So the question is, where does God live? There's an interesting comment that's made in 1 Peter chapter 2, and it goes as follows. "Ye also, as lively stones, are built up a spiritual house, an holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ." Now, we can't go into this quote, and we can't go into the book of 1 Peter in detail, but just briefly, this quotation here is speaking about the community of men and women who are faithful to God, speaking about the community of believers. And God says, "You who are believers, you who are my faithful followers, I see you as being like a living stone that is making up part of my house, part of my spiritual house." And let's think about it this way. If we love God, if we keep God at the front of our minds, then it is like God is living in our hearts. If we're continually thinking about God, if we love God, then it's as if God is living in our hearts. Or in other words, you could say that we have become part of God's house. We have become one of these lively stones, part of the spiritual house of God. And later on in 1 Peter, it talks about Jesus Christ as being the chief cornerstone of this spiritual house. So we love God and we serve God as followers of Jesus Christ. because Jesus Christ is the most important stone in this spiritual temple. Everything else is built on top of Jesus Christ. And so God can't really live in a physical temple, but God can live in our hearts. God can live in the spiritual temple of our hearts, and that is the temple that is built by Jesus Christ. And so that is one point of comparison, that Solomon built a physical temple, but Jesus Christ is the chief cornerstone and the builder of God's spiritual temple. And the other interesting point is that Ezekiel, the last chapters of Ezekiel, tell us about the future temple, the future physical temple that Jesus Christ will also build when he returns to the earth. And that physical temple will in any case be much greater than Solomon's. So there's at least 2 points of comparison there where we can say, well, yes, Solomon built a temple, but the temple that Jesus Christ will build is much greater than Solomon's. Whether we're talking about the spiritual temple or the physical temple, both the spiritual and the physical temple of Christ are much greater than the temple built by Solomon. So there's our first 3 points of comparison once again. And we can follow down that list and go, well, for each one of those we have seen that Jesus Christ is greater than Solomon. Jesus Christ is a much better interpretation of this promise to David, than Solomon was. And finally, the last point, Solomon was anointed as king before David died. But the thing is, David died very shortly after Solomon was anointed. So David didn't really get to see Solomon as king for very long, and David was also told that the throne of this son would be established forever, but Solomon didn't reign forever. But Jesus Christ will reign forever, and when Jesus Christ's kingdom is established, David will be raised back to life and made immortal. So David got to see Solomon as king for a short period of time, but David will see Jesus Christ as king for eternity. And so we can follow down in the right-hand column there each one of those 4 key points of this promise. And in each one we are forced to conclude that Jesus Christ is greater than Solomon. And so this promise to David is in fact a prophecy about Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is a much better answer to the promise. And it's important to understand that we're not just making this up. We're not just stitching these quotes together to try and make a point that the Bible doesn't really support. The Bible itself is open about this. It tells us that this promise does in fact apply to Jesus Christ. There are other Old Testament prophecies that tell us that. So Isaiah 9 verse 6 to 7. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth even forever. Now this is Isaiah prophesying. This prophecy was given long time, many hundreds of years after Solomon himself had died. But this prophecy is saying, no, there's going to be a future person who will sit on David's throne. So this promised man, this man who was promised to David, this future king, is still to come. And it's not just the Old Testament that tells us that, it's the New Testament as well. For instance, Mark 11 verse 10, when Jesus Christ had his triumphant entry into Jerusalem, and the people cried out the following, "Blessed be the kingdom of our father David that cometh in the name of the Lord." In other words, they saw that Jesus Christ would inherit the kingdom of his father David. Jesus Christ was the king of promise. And another quote, Hebrews chapter 1 verse 5. For unto which of the angels said he at any time, Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee, and again I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Now, Hebrews chapter 1 is a little bit of a complicated chapter. We don't have to understand that in detail, but we just have to see that section that has been highlighted there is a direct quote from the promise to David. It's drawing a comparison between Jesus Christ and the angels, and it's saying, well, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. You can't say that about an angel, so Jesus Christ is greater than the angels. But the important thing to understand is that's a direct quote from the promise to David. So we saw before how 1 Chronicles chapter 28 quoted the promise to David and applied it to Solomon. But now Hebrews chapter 1 quotes the same part of the promise to David and applies it to Jesus Christ. So as we said before, a really powerful method of Bible study is to get the Bible to interpret itself. And here we have the Bible interpreting itself. It tells us that there are two answers to this promise to David. There's Solomon initially, but then there's Jesus Christ, who is much greater than Solomon, who is the true king of promise. So why does this matter? Why should we try to understand this promise? What does it mean to us? Well, I thought it would be helpful to look back at the three promises. The three great promises that we've already considered the first two, and tonight we're looking at the third. So, promise number one was the promise to Eve. And the promise to Eve was the promise of life. It was the promise of being saved from the curse of death. It's interesting that Eve herself is described as being the mother of all living. And Eve was literally the mother of all living. Every living person is descended from Eve. So think about that. If Eve is the mother of all living, and she's been told that there is this curse of death upon her and her children, what do you think a mother would be more interested in than the safety of her own children? And so that is why Eve was given this promise. Because she was the mother of all living, this promise was uniquely suited to her. Eve was uniquely suited to this promise of life for her and for her children. What about the promise to Abraham? Well, the promise to Abraham was a promise of a land for him and his descendants. But let's think about Abraham's situation. Abraham had left his homeland and he was childless. And so this promise that Abraham was given promised him both a land and children. And so, as with Eve, so with Abraham, the promise that he was given fulfilled his unique desires, his unique situation. It assuaged his worries about the future. So I'm sure that all of us have worries about the future. Perhaps we have worries about money, worries about our jobs or our families or our health. We all have particular issues that are of particular concern to us. Well, these promises, the promise that was given to Eve and the promise that was given to Abraham, these promises addressed the issues that were closest to their hearts, the issues that worried them the most. So let's think about this question. What did the promise to David mean to him? What were David's unique circumstances that made this promise so valuable, so important to him? We've looked a bit at the context of David's life already, and we've known that David was known as the greatest king of Israel. And we've considered where David came, at what point in history he lived. Israel had had hundreds of years of unrest. There were some good rulers, but they were only over small parts of the nation. And during those years of unrest and periodic chaos, the other nations around Israel took advantage of the chaos. They took advantage of the instability. They constantly invaded Israel to steal their food or to impose taxes on them. But when David came, that changed. David was a very capable administrator. David was a very strong military leader. And so for the first time in history, perhaps, Israel had a very strong king who could keep them safe from their enemies and give them a strong, stable, organised government. And David also turned the people away from their idols and back to the true worship of God. David organised the priesthood to make sure that the nation would run smoothly and the worship of God would run smoothly and would continue. And because of all of that, God blessed the nation. And Israel, when David was king, achieved a level of prosperity that they had never seen before. So these were David's achievements as king. He was a remarkable man, but he was also a man of very strong character and principles. He's described as ruling with justice and righteousness. We see from the accounts of his reign that he really cared about the common people. He cared about them as a shepherd cares for his sheep. So much so that if anybody in the kingdom, no matter how unimportant, had a dispute with their neighbour, they could come directly to the king and have an audience with him, and the king would give direction and judgment on that issue, and they could be sure that they would get a just and a wise judgment. They could be sure that the king wasn't going to rule in favour of their neighbour just because their neighbour was richer or more powerful than they were. David was a just and a wise king who preserved his people from oppression. David was also a man of very strong integrity. When the previous king, King Saul, was searching for David, trying to kill him, during that period, which was probably several years, there were several occasions when David, in fact, had the opportunity to kill Saul. He had the opportunity to kill this king who was coming seeking for his life. And David refused to take those opportunities. He refused to be a murderer. He refused to kill God's anointed king. He was a man of such strong integrity. And so David had made it essentially his life's work to give his people a wise, strong, stable government. And so if you think, what would David's worry be for the future? Well, perhaps David was worried that after he died, the kingdom would pass to a foolish king who would undo all of his good work. In the words of Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes speaks about all the work that you've accomplished in your life, and it says, well, I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. And so just as the promise to Eve was uniquely suited to her, and the promise to Abraham was uniquely suited to him, so the promise to David was uniquely suited to David. David's life work was to give his people a strong, stable government. And the promise to David promised that his people would have wise leadership. And that will ultimately be fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So we see why this promise was so important to David. This was the promise of a future ruler who would lead the people in just the same way David did. The promise to David is not so much a promise about David's son as a promise of a good, wise, stable government for his people. And we can see that, in fact, this promise is concerned with the overall well-being of David's people. Because if we read verse 10 of 2 Samuel 7, he says, "Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as beforetime." So God really starts this promise with saying, I'm going to take care of your people after you're gone. I'm going to plant them so that they will move no more. I'm going to take care of their security. And when we think about that, that is really why this promise has to apply to Jesus Christ. We know that after David died, Solomon inherited the kingdom. And after Solomon died, then his son inherited the kingdom, and then his son, and then his son, and then his son, and so on and so forth. David's descendants continued to reign over the throne of Israel for hundreds of years. But they didn't all live up to David's standards. They weren't all wise, capable, godly rulers. Many of these descendants of David oppressed the common people. They turned the people away from the true worship of God. They introduced idolatry. They made unwise alliances with the nations around them that ended in disaster. These were David's descendants sitting on his throne, but they weren't the type of people that David himself would have liked. If David had lived to see these wicked kings sitting on his throne, and if you had asked David, are these the sort of kings you envisioned when you heard this promise? I'm sure that David would have said no. You think about the kings who passed their children through the fire to Molech, the kings who made alliances with the Baal worshippers. Those were not things David would have done. Those were not actions that David would have endorsed. Those were things that David would have been horrified about. Clearly, they were not what the promise intended to convey. And so when we think about that, we start to realise that this promise had to mean a king who was like David, a king who would continue David's wise rulership. When God makes a promise, God intends to keep it properly. Perhaps in the modern world we're a little bit too used to promises not really being kept in the way that they were made. You can go down the road and walk into McDonald's and order a burger, but the sad little thing you get in the cardboard box looks nothing like what you were promised by the picture on the menu. It's really a broken promise, and we're just kind of numb to that kind of thing. We have politicians who make promises and then break them routinely, and we just think, oh, well, that's what politicians do. But when God makes a promise, God means it, and God will keep his promises not just to the letter, but in the full spirit of intention. And so the promise to David is the promise of a king who would continue David's tradition of wise, just, compassionate, godly leadership, who would be a king like David. And that is exactly the type of king that Jesus Christ will be. So if you'll turn over now to Psalm 72, we can see the kind of king that Jesus Christ will be. And I'll get you to turn up Psalm 72 because there are a few verses that we're going to look through in this psalm. So Psalm 72, and this psalm is really a prophecy, another prophecy about this future kingdom of Jesus Christ. And it starts here in verse 1, "Give the king thy judgments, O God, and thy righteousness unto the king's son. He shall judge thy people with righteousness, and thy poor with judgment." Now, you notice that comment in verse 1, it talks about the king's son. So this king, this man who this prophecy is speaking about, is a king, but he's also a king's son. So you can see that's kind of picking up on the promise to David. Jesus Christ will be a king, but he will also be the son of David the king. So this king who's being spoken about in Psalm 72, this is Jesus Christ, the son of David. You see what it says there in verse 2, "He shall judge thy people with righteousness, and thy poor with judgment." So this is a king who will do justice to the poor people that he rules. He's not going to pervert judgment or be corrupt for the sake of the rich and powerful. He's going to deal justice to everybody. Verse 4 says, "He shall judge the poor of the people. He shall save the children of the needy, and shall break in pieces the oppressor." So once again, it tells us that he is going to do justice to the poor, the weak people of the land. But it also tells us that he is going to save them from the oppression by outside nations. And that, again, is what David did, gave the people safety from their enemies. And likewise, that is what Jesus Christ will do. In his kingdom, those who are part of his kingdom will be safe from oppression by anyone else. In verse 5, "They shall fear thee," that is, they shall fear Jesus Christ, they shall fear thee, they shall fear God as long as the sun and moon endure throughout all generations. So because of this rulership of Jesus Christ, the people are going to fear God throughout all generations. So just as David set up the true worship of God, so Jesus Christ will also set up the true worship of God in his kingdom, will encourage the people to serve God faithfully. And so thus far we have seen that this king, Jesus Christ, who is prophesied in Psalm 72, he's a king like David. He's merciful, he's just, he's strong to save his people from oppression by their enemies. And so thus far he is just like David, a king like David. But there is one key difference here. And that is that David ruled just over the nation of Israel. But the kingdom of Jesus Christ will be worldwide. Jesus Christ will rule over the whole earth in the future. And we see that in verse 8. It says, "He shall have dominion also from sea to sea, and from the river unto the ends of the earth." Jesus Christ's dominion is going to extend to the ends of the earth. Unlike David, his kingdom will be worldwide. And because that's a worldwide kingdom, perhaps we can start to see that this is not just a promise to David, but it's a promise to us as well. It's a promise of leadership for ourselves. In Australia, perhaps we tend to take our government for granted, and we don't realise what a powerful blessing a good government is. There are many nations in the world that don't have a strong government. And those nations can't provide many of the things that we take for granted. For example, in Australia we have free healthcare, we have safety largely from any armed gangs. But in many nations of the world, the government isn't strong enough to provide those things for their people. On the other hand, there are some nations in the world today that do have a very strong government, but that government is used to oppress the people. It's used to oppress the many for the benefit of a few powerful people at the top of the hierarchy. Perhaps we could mention Iran or perhaps Russia as countries which have a strong government but which use it to oppress their people. And it is a great blessing for us to live in a country like Australia, but even here, perhaps government corruption is more common than we would like. There are many problems as well that the government would like to solve but can't. So a good government is a difficult problem and a powerful blessing. And it's not something that we can fix easily either. Occasionally people do try to fix their government. They have a revolution, they depose the current government and they say, no, we're going to install something better. And that usually ends quite badly. We are notoriously bad at working out what form of government will suit us. There was the French Revolution that began in 1798. That followed years of oppression of the poor people by the king. So they had this revolution, they deposed the king and they executed the king. But it didn't lead to prosperity and peace for their people. Instead, it led to the reign of terror, in which thousands of people, innocent people, were sent to the guillotine. And there was instability in the kingdom for the next 10 years, until in 1799 Napoleon seized power and he set himself up, essentially as another king. So the nation tried to improve their own government, they tried to replace it with something better, but what they found is that it only led to instability and chaos. Human governments are very rarely good. There was the Russian Revolution in 1917. They also executed their king and they set up a communist government. But the communist government also degenerated into an oppressive dictatorship. It was led by the likes of Joseph Stalin, who is believed to have been directly responsible for the deaths of 20 million people. Or we could look at England. There was a less sensational revolution in England in 1649 when Charles I was executed. And, well, Charles I had tried to wrest control of the country away from the Parliament. He'd tried to set himself up as an absolute dictator. So they executed Charles I and they set up a republican government. They thought this would be much better, but it turned out that the republican government itself turned into an oppressive dictatorship. And by 1660, 11 years later, the people were so desperate to get the king back that they sent messengers to Charles II, who was the son of the king they had executed, and they brought him back to be king in his stead. They decided that, well, having a king may not have been perfect, but at least it was stable. So if history tells us anything, let it be this: we can't underestimate what a blessing it is to live in a country with a strong, stable government that truly cares about its people. And we also can't estimate just how difficult it is to achieve that, just how difficult a problem it is to get a government that works well. So the promise to David is a promise to us. It promises us the opportunity of living in a kingdom ruled by the wisdom and power of Jesus Christ, ruled by the greatest man who has ever lived, a man of incredible wisdom, a man of absolute integrity, a man of perfect compassion, a man who has the power and goodness of God himself. In the kingdom of Jesus Christ, we won't have to worry about the government becoming corrupt, because it will be ruled by a man who is God's representative, a man who is morally perfect. We won't have to worry about a revolution or an invasion, because the kingdom will last forever. It will have the authority of God himself. But this promise to us is not just a promise of being a part of this kingdom. Before David became king, there was a period of several years when he was being chased around the country by the previous king Saul, and David was an exile, an outcast. David was wandering about the country with a small band of loyal followers. But when David did finally become king, all of those men who had been loyal to him throughout all of those years, those men helped David to rule the kingdom when he finally became king. And it will be the same with Jesus Christ. At the moment, being a follower of Jesus Christ means being separated from the rest of the world to some extent. It means giving up on some of the pleasures and distractions that we could enjoy right now. It means being like one of David's small band of followers in the wilderness. But when Jesus Christ returns, the Bible tells us that all of his loyal followers will have the privilege of helping him to rule in his kingdom. The kingdom that will exercise justice, mercy, compassion, and bring in worldwide prosperity for everyone on the face of the earth. And that is the promise to us in the promise to David. And we can finish with this quote from 2 Timothy chapter 2. Therefore I endure all things for the elect's sakes, that they also may obtain the salvation which is in Jesus Christ with eternal glory. It is a faithful saying, for if we be dead with him, we shall also live with him. If we suffer, we shall also reign with him.